Welcome to Environmental Laws, a podcast where timely and relevant EHS topics are discussed by Thompson Hine attorneys and industry experts. For those who don't know, the acronym LAWS stands for Land, Air, Water, and Safety. My name is Nathan Hunt. I'm an attorney in Thompson Hine's Environmental Practice Group. Today's podcast is part 2 of a 2-part podcast about the Love Canal environmental disaster and the role it played in passage of the federal CERCLA statute, which many know better as Superfund. In part 1, we met William Love, a visionary or swindler, depending on whom you believe. Love wanted to build a utopian model city in Western New York that was powered by free hydroelectricity generated by a 7-mile canal connecting the upper and lower Niagara River. Work on his canal began in the 1890s to much fanfare, but only a half-mile or so of canal was dug before funding dried up and the project was abandoned. Please give part 1 of the podcast a listen if you want to learn more about William Love and the rise and fall of his planned dream city. For a time after the project was abandoned, the canal was used by locals as a swimming pond in the summer and ice skating in the winter. By the 1920s, the city of Niagara was using the canal as a landfill. What better use for a giant hole in the ground? Hooker Chemical acquired the property from the city in 1942 and used it to dispose of chemical wastes. By the early 1950s, Hooker had filled the canal with at least 20,000 tons of mostly drummed chemical wastes. Once it was filled, Hooker covered the waste in the canal with a clay and dirt cap. Then it sold the property back to the city for $1, but not before including language in the deed that disclaimed any responsibility for the waste Hooker had buried in the canal. So to what purpose do you think the city dedicated its newly acquired waste dump? Give yourself a pat on the back if you guessed building the 400-student 99th Street School on the site in 1955. The school was quickly surrounded by blocks of hundreds of new working-class homes. A perplexing question about all of this is, why would anyone choose to live there? It was no secret to the local community the canal was used as a landfill, then a chemical dump site for 30-plus years. Perhaps a new school with new homes in a planned community with amenities like playgrounds was appealing to many people. It also may have been the case of out of sight, out of mind, since the wastes were thought to be safely buried beneath the surface and for that reason weren't top of mind. Another possible explanation is the public believed local government would not have allowed the school and surrounding community to be built if the location was unsafe. It likely was a combination of all these factors, but perhaps most significantly, many people in the community probably didn't appreciate the potential dangers associated with the wastes dumped in the canal. The risks to human health and the environment from chemical exposures weren't widely understood by the general public in the 1950s and 1960s. It would take events like the Love Canal disaster in the 1970s for the public and many government institutions, for that matter, to appreciate the dangers of chemical exposures and the need to properly manage hazardous wastes. So what happened? What was this disaster that made the name Love Canal synonymous with toxic waste dump? The first signs of trouble were strange chemical odors in homes, particularly those with basements. Other people in the community observed unexplained residues on the ground or the surfaces of buildings. Some people even reported children who were playing outside returning home with chemical burns on their skin. In 1976, though, the proverbial dam broke. A combination of record-breaking snow and rainfall caused contaminated groundwater to migrate to the surface. Corroded chemical drums broke through the ground. Contaminated groundwater seeped into basements. A journalist who visited the area reported the air had, quote, a faint choking smell. All of this was followed by a sharp rise in miscarriages and birth defects in the community, elevated white blood cell levels, which are a potential precursor to leukemia, and chromosomal abnormalities also were reported. The escape of contaminated groundwater from beneath the ground surface was also blamed on construction in the area during its development that breached the clay and soil cap that Hooker had put in place after filling the canal. Pictures of the surrounding area are fascinating, and I strongly recommend anyone who has not seen them to do so, particularly pictures that show homes lining both sides of the former canal. People's backyards literally backing up to the canal site filled with chemical wastes. Action was demanded of local and state governments to address the situation. Many rallied around Lois Gibbs, a local mother turned environmental activist who became a prominent community advocate. But the government response was too slow for most, and public anger and distrust reached a boiling point after little action had been taken in the first few years to address the crisis. It wasn't until the spring of 1978, nearly 2 years later, that New York declared a state of emergency. Thereafter, a system was installed to collect leachate from the landfill. The 99th Street School we previously discussed was closed. Pregnant women and women with young children were advised to evacuate the area, and some funding was provided to evacuate those families living closest to the canal. But many families remained and felt their concerns weren't being addressed. By 1980, some residents were so desperate they briefly held hostage 2 US EPA representatives to bring attention to the plight of the community. The crisis eventually captured the national spotlight, which prompted federal action. In August 1978 and May 1980, President Carter issued emergency declarations that provided federal funding to address the contamination, evacuate additional residents, and pay for new homes for some of the evacuees. Eventually, 950 of the 1,050 families living in the immediate 10 square block area surrounding the canal were relocated. As for Hooker Chemical, despite the deed language it provided to the city disclaiming responsibility for the chemical waste, Hooker and its successors eventually agreed to pay the United States restitution of approximately $129 million, along with additional amounts to resolve lawsuits brought by residents of Love Canal. Perhaps Love Canal's most significant legacy is the 1980 passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA for short. CERCLA was enacted as a direct result of the crisis, and Love Canal became the first Superfund site. Many know the law better as Superfund because it established a trust fund that provided the federal government with the means to clean up hazardous waste sites where a responsible polluter could not be identified. The disposal practices that led to the crisis were not unique to Love Canal, and it was realized that there would be more disasters to come. As a result, CERCLA was passed in part to address the inadequacies of the initial government response to the disaster by providing the federal government with the means to take necessary action to address these hundreds, if not thousands, of other potential Love Canals, then obtain reimbursement from the parties responsible for contamination through a liability scheme that made nearly any party connected to a waste site legally responsible for its cleanup. Former owners and operators of sites, current owners and operators of sites, those who sent waste to sites, and even certain transporters of wastes to sites, all are designated as potentially responsible parties under the law. CERCLA is still going strong 44 years after its passage. As for the Love Canal Superfund site, what once was is again. The site was removed from CERCLA's national priorities list in 2004, and certain areas of the site beyond the immediate area of the canal have been declared safe for residential occupation. At least 260 abandoned homes have been rehabilitated and sold to new residents. In the end, author Marissa Brooke perhaps put it best when she wrote, quote, "There is a sad irony in the fact that the site of William T. Love's most perfect city in existence became home to such a disaster." I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Please be sure to check out part 1 of the podcast to learn more about William Love and his quest for a utopia in Western New York.